She was hunting scrap metal in the jungle just to pay rent. What she found instead was a sealed, moss-covered vault, forgotten by time, hidden beneath the roots. Inside were classified crates, stamped U.S. Army, and folders marked MIA, divided by POW records. But one name inside changed everything. Not just a mystery solved, a life rewritten. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about discovery, truth, and unexpected redemption move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will shake you even harder than this one. Willa Madsen didn't believe in fate. She believed in rusted bolts, broken chains, and the kind of stubborn survival that smelled like grease and damp earth. That morning, she was elbow-deep in jungle soil behind a collapsed outpost 3 miles from the nearest road, looking for scrap metal to sell by the kilo. Her gloves were torn, her boots duct-taped, and her backpack had more holes than pockets. But it was all she had, and she'd made peace with that. The jungle around her buzzed birds, insects, the far-off hush of a river, but inside her mind, everything was focused. One more metal find, and she could pay off her generator repair. Maybe even get a hot meal. That's all this trip was supposed to be. She nearly missed it. The vine-covered slope was nothing special. Just moss, soil, and thick tangles of green, the kind that swallowed whole bunkers during the war. But when she yanked on what she thought was a metal bracket, the ground trembled beneath her boots. A clank echoed deep, hollow, artificial. She froze. That sound wasn't from junk. That was a door. She pulled her machete and cleared the vines in frantic sweeps, revealing a round metal hatch about 5 feet across, almost entirely swallowed by the earth. It had rusted edges, a thick rotating handle, and 3 bolts securing it like a vault. No markings, no visible numbers, just the faint imprint of something that might once have read U.S. Army property of DOD. Willa blinked. Her breath slowed. This wasn't scrap. She dropped to one knee and ran her fingers along the seal. Moss flaked away. There was no visible keyhole, but the center crank might still turn. She dug out a small crowbar from her pack, wedged it beneath the locking teeth, and leaned her full weight on it. The metal groaned like something waking from a long, bitter sleep. 30 minutes later, sweat dripping and hands cramping, the hatch finally gave. The thick door swung inward with a slow, scraping groan. Cool, dry air poured out. Not the sour rot of decay, but preserved silence, sterile and untouched. Willa stepped back, heart pounding, and looked inside. The space was no bigger than a garden shed, carved into earth and steel. A single bulb flickered to life from a motion sensor, revealing metal shelves stacked with green ammo boxes, sealed crates, and a dusty reel-to-reel machine on a desk bolted to the far wall. On that same wall were pinned 3 sheets of yellowed paper, held by rusted clips. She stepped in slowly, eyes scanning. The papers read, Operation Malaroa, records. Her breath hitched. Then, her eyes dropped to the folders on the table, stamped across the top in bold, stenciled letters. Missing in action. 1970. 1 North Sector. She reached out, hand trembling slightly, and flipped one open. The first name on the list hit like a punch to the ribs. Sergeant Richard Avery, her mother's maiden name. Willa stared. Her legs wobbled. A whisper from the past had just stepped into the light, and she was standing in a vault full of voices that were never supposed to be found. Willa sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, fingers hovering above the folder like it might vanish. The name inside Sergeant Richard Avery wasn't just a name. It was the ghost that had lingered in her mother's stories, whispered late at night after too much wine and not enough peace. Her grandfather, gone in 71, recon mission, North Vietnam. Never came home. Never declared dead either, just disappeared. Growing up, Willa thought it was myth. A tale to explain why her mother never quite settled, always scanning crowds like someone might show up late to a decades-old reunion. Now, here it was in her hands, paper proof. She peeled open the folder slowly. Inside, a black and white photo of a man in fatigues, crouched beside a chopper. The resemblance was uncanny. The jaw, the crease between the brows, the same tired spark Willa had seen in the mirror more than once. Next to the photo, a typed sheet. Mission logs, dates, last known coordinates, operation name, Echo Dust. She didn't recognize it. And that alone meant something. Most ops had been declassified. This one? Buried. Behind the folders were more reels. Thin magnetic tape wound tightly on steel. Labeled by hand, one read, June 1970. 2. Audio capture Echo Dust Bravo. Another, Intel hold, unsorted. A few were smeared. Some were blank. But they all buzzed with the weight of something too important to leave behind. The rest of the bunker felt like a time capsule. The air was filtered, dry. A small generator in the corner, long dead but clean. A metal cot, folded neatly, never slept in. On a back shelf, a canteen and 2 unopened rations. Someone had prepared this space not to live in, but to hide something. And whatever that something was, it hadn't been touched in 50 years. Then she noticed it. Tucked beneath the table, bolted into the floor, was a smaller green box. Not a file crate. Not standard military issue. It was rounded at the edges and painted over in a darker tone. At the center, a lock not old, not rusted. Newer metal, faintly polished, and not the kind used by the army. Willa crouched, brushing off the dirt. There was no keyhole, just a small slot, rectangular, like it was made for a badge or magnetic card. Her stomach knotted. She'd opened a sealed vault, hidden under decades of growth, only to find a second box sealed tighter than the first. That lock didn't belong to the jungle. It belonged to someone who hadn't wanted this found, not just hidden, protected, maybe even trapped. She backed away slowly, heart thudding in her chest. The forest was silent again, as if holding its breath. Then the questions started. Who locked it? Why the newer tech? Why keep records like this here, in this specific place? And why the hell did it have her grandfather's name on it? The bunker had waited decades in silence. Now, it was her turn to listen. Willa sat in the motel that night. The folder spread out on the bed like a crime scene she didn't know how to process. The photo of Sergeant Richard Avery stared up at her, young, confident, unaware that his name would one day end up buried in a jungle vault and rediscovered by a granddaughter he never got to meet. The resemblance was uncanny. Same jawline, same squint in the Sunday. She had always wondered why her mom stared at her so hard sometimes, like she was trying to remember someone. Maybe now she understood. The room smelled like mildew and old fabric softener. A single lamp buzzed in the corner. Willa's boots were muddy, her knees still sore from crouching in the vault. But none of that mattered. The real weight sat on her lap. A name, a legacy, and 50 years of silence pressed into faded ink. She picked up the photo again and turned it over. Written in faint pencil on the back. R. Avery Echo Dust, 5th Group, 1970. 1. Last seen near Lao border. Echo Dust. That code name again. She tried searching it online, but nothing came up. Not in military records, not in old newspaper scans, not even on conspiracy blogs. Whatever it was, it had been erased, or hidden so deep that the only trace left was sealed in that underground steel coffin. Her phone buzzed. A message from her mom. All good? You went dark. Willa stared at it for a long moment. She almost typed back, I found him. But how do you text something like that? How do you break 50 years of grief through a glowing screen? Instead, she sent, Got something. I'll call you tomorrow. Then she returned to the folder. At the back was a second page. No photo, just a list. 5 names. All marked MIA, North Sector. Her grandfather's was at the top. Next to it, typed coordinates and something stranger. A line that read, "Subject transferred. Status, unknown. Asset, sensitive." Willa's fingers tightened on the paper. Transferred? Not killed. Not abandoned. Transferred. Like cargo. Her gut turned. This wasn't just about loss. This was about movement, concealment, intentional disappearance. Someone had made a decision not in the heat of war, but with a pen and a folder, deciding who got remembered and who got erased. She looked over at the sealed green lockbox again in the corner of her room. She'd pried it out of the bunker with a crowbar and dragged it uphill on a makeshift sled. The magnetic lock still blinked faintly, like it was waiting for a code that hadn't been spoken in half a century. And for the first time since cracking open that rusted door, Willa felt something shift inside her, not just curiosity but responsibility. This wasn't just a scavenger's lucky find. This was a rescue, a truth, buried alive. And if the world had forgotten her grandfather, then maybe it was her job to remember, to unseal the silence, to find out what echo dust really meant. The motel's air conditioner rattled like it was trying to cough up its last breath. Willa sat hunched over the reel-to-reel tape deck, wires from her old battery inverter snaking across the carpet. She'd taken electronics apart since she was 10 radios, carburetors, the occasional VCR her mom swore was still working, but this thing was different. Military issue, mid-70 seconds. No modern ports, no play button, just switches labeled in all caps. Capture, relay, scan. She finally bypassed the power circuit and fed a low current through the main board. The reel spun. A soft crackle filled the room. She adjusted the gain knob, and then a voice. Grainy, low, male, American accent, tinny through the years. He was reciting numbers, clipped and calm. Prisoner 1, Sergeant Richard Avery, United States Army. Serial 195340. Operation Echo Dust. Location, Sector 7 North. Repeat, Sector 7 North. Willa's stomach dropped. It was him, her grandfather's voice. Real, alive, breathing in a place no one had confirmed he ever existed. She pressed pause, then play again, just to be sure. Requesting confirmation of Geneva compliance. Requesting verification of medical care. Still holding. Day 63. The tape hissed and skipped, then silence. She rewound. Nothing came after. Just that one sliver, a captured moment of fear and formality, one man's proof of life scratched into old tape. She covered her mouth, suddenly aware she was shaking. Not from cold, but from recognition. From grief she didn't even know she'd inherited. She spent the next hour cataloging everything in the vault. Every crate, every file. 5 POWs. All marked, transferred. All with similar audio logs. None of them had ever been accounted for. And every one of their families like hers had probably spent decades wondering if they'd just been abandoned, forgotten in some jungle cell, buried under paperwork no one wanted to read. But it wasn't just records down there. It was stories, breath, proof. And someone had wanted them sealed so deep they'd never crawl their way back to daylight. Willa flipped on her laptop, eyes darting through open tabs of military records, public archives, anything she could get her hands on. But none of the names appeared in any casualty databases. No Kia reports. No graves. That meant only one thing. Someone had intervened. She paused when she noticed something on one of the folders she hadn't seen before. A signature on the bottom corner. Vault. Secured by Colonel T. Moss, under Article 17. She sat back. Colonel Moss. She didn't know the name, but suddenly, it felt like a map marker. If the men had vanished, and the military didn't know or didn't want to admit, then maybe whoever sealed that vault had answers, or guilt, or both. And somewhere out there, Willa figured, Colonel T. Moss was either long gone or still waiting for the past to knock on his door. It started with a phone number scribbled on the edge of a declassified service roster tucked inside one of the green crates. Willa almost missed it, faint pencil, smudged by time and damp air. But The name next to it was unmistakable. Colonel Trenton Moss. She didn't know if the number still worked, if he was even alive, but she dialed it anyway, heart pounding like a starter motor refusing to turn. 3 rings, then 4. On the 6th, a voice gravelly, wary. "Hello?" She froze for a beat. Then, "Colonel Moss?" Silence. "Who is this?" he asked, clipped and sharp. He still carried command in his voice, like a switch he'd never turned off. "My name is Willa Madsen," she said carefully. "I found something. A vault, with files from Operation Echo Dust." Another silence. This one longer. Heavy. "Where?" "Outside Lang Biang Ridge," she said. "Vietnam. The files have your name on them. And Richard Avery's. My grandfather." "That did it. I'll call you back," he said. The line went dead. She stared at the phone. 45 seconds later, it rang again this time. Video. When she answered, she saw a man in his late 70s. White hair, tight military bearing even through a shaky screen. Behind him, a wall of books and medals. He blinked at her. "You said Avery?" She nodded. "My mom's father." He ran a hand over his mouth, then exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for decades. "I thought that vault was lost," he said. "Guess nothing stays buried forever." Willa leaned forward. "You sealed it? I built it," Moss replied. "I was the operations engineer on Echo Dust. Wasn't supposed to be. Got pulled in after the mission went south. They told me to erase it, burn everything. But I couldn't." He looked down. "I buried it instead." Willa didn't speak. She didn't have to. "It wasn't just a recon mission," Moss continued. "Echo Dust was a trade protocol. Off-book. Prisoner swaps. Intel. Quiet deals. Men like your grandfather, they weren't supposed to come back. Their existence complicated things." Her jaw tightened. "So you just left them?" "No," Moss said quickly. "I wanted to bring them home. I argued, got reprimanded, almost stripped of rank. They told me it was national security. Operational necessity. They were good men. And I couldn't do it. So I copied everything I could, hid the originals, and left them with the only honesty I had left: silence." Willa's throat ached. Moss leaned closer to the screen. "I always wondered if anyone would find it. Thought maybe someday the truth would matter again." "It does," she said quietly. "It matters now." His eyes softened. "Then let's finish what we started." He gave her an address in rural Georgia. "Come see me," he said. "There's more I never wrote down. Some of it never made it to paper. Some things you only trust to memory." Willa nodded. She didn't know what she was stepping into, but she knew she couldn't turn back. The past was awake now, and it was waiting to be heard. The bus ride to Georgia was long, hot, and slow. Willa spent most of it staring out the window, the sealed lockbox wrapped in her backpack like a weight she couldn't shift. She'd thought about flying, renting a car, even shipping the materials home. But none of it felt right. This wasn't cargo. It was memory, and you don't mail memory in bubble wrap. She arrived at Colonel Trenton Moss's house just before sunset. It was a modest place brick, 1 story, lawn clipped with military precision. The kind of house where nothing was wasted and everything had its place. He was waiting on the porch in a folding chair, dressed in worn khakis and a polo with a faded army insignia over the heart. He didn't smile when he saw her, but he nodded once, and somehow that was enough. Inside, his living room was more like a private archive. Shelves of books on military history, framed newspaper clippings, a flag folded tight in a triangle beneath glass. And on one table, a thick, leather-bound journal so well worn the edges had curled. "I started writing it in '72, Moss said. "Didn't stop until the day I retired." Willa sat across from him, the lockbox at her feet. She hesitated, then unzipped her bag and placed it on the table between them. He stared at it for a long time, then reached out, brushing his fingers across the top. "Still locked," he murmured. "You know how to open it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and walked to a small drawer beneath the bookcase. He pulled out a flat brass rectangle, no bigger than a credit card, faint, etching along one edge. It looked like a keycard, but older. Hand-stamped. "I swore I'd never use this again," he said, placing it on the table. "But you found the vault, and your Avery's blood." He slid the card into the slot. The lock clicked. A low, mechanical whir followed, like something dormant remembering how to wake up. Willa exhaled as the lid rose slowly, revealing the contents inside. There were only a few items. A black tape labeled, "Final exchange not logged." A red folder stamped, "Top secret. Eyes only." And a single dog tag. Moss picked up the tag. His hand shook. "I watched him hand this to the liaison," he said. "Your grandfather, July 1971. He was being processed for a prisoner trade, one of the early ones we weren't supposed to record." Willa's voice cracked. "He was traded?" Moss nodded slowly. "That was the deal. The Vietnamese held him, but another government louse had interest. He knew too much. Radio frequencies, encryption standards, troop movements. We didn't think they'd go through with it, but they did. And the State Department? They buried it." He opened the red folder. Inside were telegrams, cables, and a signed order from a ranking intelligence official. "Redact all records. Subject reclassified as unknown. Do not pursue." "They called it necessary," Moss whispered. "Said the war needed closure, not complications. So they buried 5 lives to keep one headline clean." Willa sat back, the weight of it all pressing down like the Georgia heat outside. "You could have burned this. Destroyed it." "I almost did," Moss admitted. "But then I thought of his face, of the others, of what it meant if even one person came looking." He looked at her now, eyes steady. "You're that person." Willa didn't know what to say. She just looked at the tape in her hand. Black plastic, fragile, containing the truth no one had wanted but everyone deserved. She whispered, "Let's hear it." The tape clicked into place with a soft mechanical clunk, like the closing of a door behind them. Willa and Moss sat in silence, watching the reel spin to life. The device was old but sturdy, and the audio hissed like it had aged in a cave, brittle, fragile. Then, through the crackle, came the first voice. Male, American, calm. The words were clipped, like they'd been practiced. "Prisoner 1, Sergeant Richard Avery, United States Army. Echo dust, day 76. Recording for identification." Willa felt her throat go tight. "Alongside me are Staff Sergeant Diego Cruz, Lieutenant Paul Yee, Corporal Lenny Rourke, Private Will Harper. All alive, all aware, all held, somewhere in the northern sector. Unsure of precise coordinates." There was a pause. Then another voice, tired, rasping. "They say we're not prisoners. They say we're protected assets, not POWs, but we're being moved again. We think this is it. Last move. If this message makes it back, tell my sister the dog's name was really Buddy, not Ranger." I lied so she wouldn't laugh at me. A chuckle followed, raw and sad. Then Richard's voice again, quieter this time. "If this tape is recovered, we were here. We didn't vanish. We waited." The tape hissed again, then cut to static. A long, empty stretch of white noise. Moss reached forward and stopped it. For a long while, neither of them spoke. "They kept making them record that?" Willa finally asked. Moss nodded. "Every 2 weeks. Part of the cover. Make them feel like someone was listening. Truth is, no one was. Not anymore." Willa rubbed her hands over her face. "So they just moved them, hid them, like furniture no one wanted?" "No," Moss said softly. "Like secrets." He pulled out another folder, one Willa hadn't seen yet. Inside were photos, satellite prints, handwritten maps, and one grainy image of a compound, deep in the jungle. Guard towers, makeshift barracks, no flags. "This is where they were taken," Moss said. Not Vietnamese run. Not officially. We think it was a joint facility. Parts of Laos, parts of China. Maybe even CIA, black on the edges. Willa stared at the photo. Is it still there? He shook his head. Satellite imagery from the early 2000s shows it's gone. Cleared. Flattened like it never existed. But the records what you found are the only proof it ever did. She leaned back, the reel still humming softly, like a heartbeat under static. For years, she'd grown up believing her grandfather was a name in a folded flag. Now she had his voice, his last words, the names of the men beside him. They hadn't just disappeared, they'd been silenced. But not anymore. Moss slid the tape back into its case. You know what comes next. Willa nodded. We tell them. The families. Everyone. And they'll come for you, Moss warned. The kind of people who kept this buried? They won't like the lid coming off. I don't care, Willa said. They had their silence. Now it's our turn. And in that moment, surrounded by yellowed folders, magnetic reels, and the heavy hum of uncovered history, Willa felt something new rising in her, not just grief, but purpose. The man who answered the door didn't smile. His eyes studied Willa, the way a mechanic studies a broken carburetor, not unkindly, but with a caution shaped by years of disappointment. He wore a plaid shirt tucked into jeans, sleeves rolled high over forearms that had once been thick with strength. Now they trembled slightly, like the memory of muscle. You're the girl who called about Rourke, he asked. Willa nodded. You're William Harper? He gave a single nod. People around here just call me Bill. They stood in silence for a breath. You'd better come in, he said. The house was simple, the air stale with the smell of old paper and dust. On the mantel above the fireplace, Willa noticed a faded photo. 5 young soldiers, arms draped over each other's shoulders, boots in red mud, grinning like idiots in a world about to forget them. She pointed. That's them. Bill followed her gaze. Yeah, that's us. Rourke, Cruz, Avery, Yee, and me. That was 3 days before we got pulled into echo dust. Willa sat across from him at a small kitchen table. The folder was in her hands, trembling just enough to make the pages whisper against each other. She laid out the photo, the real transcripts, and finally, Richard Avery's dog tag. Bill stared at it for a long time. I thought that was gone forever. You were declared dead, she said. All of you. I know. He exhaled, leaning back. They told me not to talk about it when I got out. Said it would muddy the official record. You ever have your life erased? Not just forgotten erased? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. We were moved every few weeks, he said. No contact, no sunlight. Some of the guys broke inside. Rourke started seeing people that weren't there. Avery, he stayed sharp. Wrote notes in the seams of his boots. Talked to himself in code so the guards wouldn't catch on. Did you know he was my grandfather? Bill nodded slowly. He talked about you. Said his daughter was 3 when he left. Kept a photo in his sock. Every time we moved, he'd unwrap it, check it for damage, then put it back, like it was the last good thing in the world. Willa's eyes stung. I owe him, Bill continued. I escaped during a transport fluke, really. Rainstorm washed out a path I ran. Ended up across the border. Got picked up by locals. CIA debriefed me for weeks. Then shelved me. Said I was lucky. Told me to disappear. You never tried to find the others? I tried, he said, voice low. But no one wanted them found. Every door I knocked on closed before I got to ask. He leaned forward now, hands clasped. But if you're opening this again, I want in. Willa reached across the table, placing her hand over his. We're not just opening it, she said. We're finishing it. And just like that, a soldier long buried by silence joined the fight for the truth. Not with weapons this time, but with memory. The press conference was never part of Willa's plan. She preferred grease to microphones, shadows to spotlights. But when she and Bill Harper walked into the local Veterans Hall with 2 file boxes and a flash drive, the ripples began. A junior reporter from a regional outlet caught wind of it first. Then a retired POW advocate contacted a national desk. Within 2 weeks, it snowballed into something Willa could barely control and wasn't trying to. They didn't sensationalize it. No dramatics. No conspiracies. Just facts. A sealed Cold War vault. Suppressed audio recordings. Orders to bury the truth. And 5 names that never got carved into any wall because someone decided closure was better than accuracy. Willa stood beside a projection screen, hands shaking as she read from Sergeant Avery's file. His voice, pulled from the reel-to-reel, played softly through the speakers. The words weren't heroic or loud, just tired, steady, human. If you find this, we were here. We didn't vanish. We waited. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. After the conference, the phone calls started. Families, sons, daughters, nieces who had grown up thinking the stories were just that, stories. Myths wrapped in dog tags. One woman from Michigan sobbed so hard she couldn't get through her own name. Her father had been Staff Sergeant Cruz. For 50 years she thought he'd died in Laos. Now, she held a scanned letter he'd written in captivity, pulled from the lockbox Willa had found. The government response was slow, calculated. At first, they issued the usual language. We are reviewing new evidence with respect and urgency. But behind closed doors, things began to shift. Willa's inbox filled with interview requests. Advocacy groups offered legal support. A congressman from North Carolina called it the most significant POW evidence recovery in decades. Still, Willa kept it grounded. She didn't care about headlines. She cared about the letters. The photos, the dog tags that deserved more than dust and metal silence. Back home, she watched her mother hold her father's dog tag for the first time since she was a child. Her hands trembled. Her eyes scanned the name over and over like it might vanish. I thought he forgot us, she whispered. But he never did. Willa didn't reply. She just pulled her close. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a response, just a place to land. A week later, Colonel Trenton Moss testified in a closed hearing. Bill Harper sat in the front row, wearing a faded army jacket and holding a folder full of names no longer forgotten. By month's end, the Department of Defense formally acknowledged Operation Echo Dust. Not a full declassification, but enough. Enough to update the records. Enough to place 5 names where they always belonged. On the wall, in the books, and in history. The jungle was quieter this time. Willa stood beneath the tangled canopy, the same slope that had once hidden the hatch now cleared and marked. A new plaque stood where vines once clung, brushed steel, hand-welded by a Vietnam vet in Georgia, funded by a dozen families who had once carried the ache of not knowing. It read, "To the 5 who waited, you were never forgotten. You were just buried beneath silence. May the truth always rise." The vault had been resealed, not to hide, but to preserve. Inside, the reels had been digitized, the originals returned to rest in temperature-controlled storage. The empty cot, the files, the lockbox, all left as they were. A time capsule, sealed with intention, no longer haunted by secrecy but honored by truth. Willa stood with her mother beside her, hand in hand. A dozen families circled the clearing. Some cried. Some smiled. One teenage girl ran her fingers along her great-uncle's name like it was a story finally told. Bill Harper was there, too, dressed in full uniform. He hadn't worn it in 50 years. He stood like a man who had finally returned from a war nobody knew he was still fighting. The ceremony wasn't grand, just a reading, a bell for each name, and then silence, the respectful kind, the kind that means someone has been heard. Afterward, Willa placed her grandfather's dog tag into a glass case mounted to the new memorial post. It didn't need to be carried anymore. It had found its place. Back home in the States, things kept moving. Bill spoke at veterans groups. Willa declined a book deal. She wasn't interested in publishing a memoir. She started a foundation instead, Echo Rise, dedicated to recovering untold POW stories and giving families access to long-buried documents. It was never about politics. It was about dignity. She went back to working on engines in her off hours, her hands still stained with grease. But something had shifted. People brought her not just broken things, but stories, a son's letters, a father's old badge, a photo of someone last seen in uniform. She listened, not to fix, but to remember. One day, she found a handwritten envelope in her mailbox, with no return address. Inside was a photo her grandfather, holding a baby girl in his lap. On the back, someone had scribbled, "She's worth waiting for." Her mother cried for hours after that. The original lockbox now sat in her shop. She had it cleaned but left the dents and scratches scars worth keeping. Inside, she kept copies of the letters, the reels, a small folded flag. And beneath all that, taped to the underside of the lid, was a note she'd written to herself the night she came home from Georgia. Sometimes, truth doesn't shout. It waits. And when someone finally listens, it knows what to say. As twilight settled over the town, Willa turned out the lights in her garage one by one. Not with burden, not with exhaustion, but with peace. Because the past hadn't stayed buried, and the future at long last had something honest to stand on.